Welcome to the Voices of War, a podcast with a simple vision to bring to life the true costs of war through the voices of those who've lived it. I'm your host Maz, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Before we start, please note that I recorded this episode with Andrew Quilty on the 9th of June. Since then, the situation in Afghanistan has changed significantly. You can follow updates from the ground via Andrew's Twitter page, @AndrewQuilty. Now let's get to the episode. My guest today is photojournalist Andrew Quilty. After completing high school, Andrew was given a camera by a late uncle, a photographer himself, which was the only item thieves failed to discover while he and two friends surfed one afternoon during a 6-month trip around Australia in 2001. Andrew studied photography in Sydney, and before knowing where he wanted to take it, was offered work experience by a customer at the liquor store where he worked. And this customer was also the photo editor at the Australian Financial Review newspaper at the time. There, Andrew fell in with some of Australia's preeminent photojournalists working upstairs at the Sydney Morning Herald. And it is people there who in many ways shaped his worldview and future career. After finishing at Fairfax in 2010, Andrew freelanced from Sydney, then moved to New York City, and eventually to Kabul, Afghanistan, after a 2-week trip to photograph the Afghan cricket team, turned into an odyssey now into its 8th year. Andrew has worked in all but a handful of Afghanistan's 34 provinces, photographed for most of the world's premier publications, and won several accolades, including a World Press Photo Award, a Polk Award, several Picture of the Year International Awards, and the Gold Walkley, Australian journalism's highest honour. More recently, Andrew has focused on the written word. His 18-month investigation into a CIA-led Afghan militia responsible for several massacres in 2019 for the Intercept was recently the recipient of an Overseas Press Club of America award. His most recent piece, published in the April edition of The Monthly, is titled The Worst Form of Defence, New Revelations of Australian War Crimes in Afghanistan, which is an investigation into alleged war crimes by Australian Special Forces in Uruzgan. This, of course, is separate to the Brereton report released in November last year. Andrew, it's an absolute pleasure to host you on the podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Maz.
You've had quite an amazing journey, mate, and just reading your background, you've done quite a lot. But before we delve into some of your experiences, I'm keen to hear about this camera that your uncle gave you. What's the story behind that?
The camera was an old Nikon F3, which was once upon a time the go-to camera for press photographers around the world. And I was given one by, as you mentioned, a late uncle who was a photographer in Sydney, and who, although having died when I was in the latter years of high school, was someone who I really looked up to in my formative years. And despite the influence he had on me and the fact that I looked up to him a lot, my entry into photography happened quite by chance. He had given me the camera, as you also mentioned, just before I took off around Australia for 6 months with a couple of mates, with no intention of using the camera as a serious tool, as anything other than a way of taking what I guess anyone would call happy snaps, documenting our trip very casually. But halfway around Australia, I sort of realised that I was quite enjoying using it, and very very casually, just documenting this trip, documenting my friends and the places we went, the people we met. And soon before we arrived home back in Sydney, I thought, well, maybe this is something I can use as a creative tool, and something I can also possibly make a career out of. So I enrolled in TAFE in Sydney at Ultimo, and without really knowing where I wanted to take it, I could just as easily have ended up working in fashion or commercial photography or sport or conflict photography, I suppose. But as you also mentioned, I was really shaped by the people I fell in with when I ended up at Fairfax in Sydney, and who I suppose took the lead from my uncle who'd given me the camera in the first place, and started, I guess, changing my view of the world and the kinds of things that I felt were worthwhile pointing a camera at.
What was it about photography or the camera as a tool that captured you?
To be honest, it was really a practical decision based upon the fact that I, having left a private boys' school in Sydney, where it was really kind of drilled into everyone that you had to go on to university and have a career, and regardless of what your passions or how the way you viewed the world influenced the work you would go on to do. And so at school, I was most interested in visual art, in painting and drawing and these kinds of things, but I never really saw that as a viable option as a career for me. So it was like this clash of the two things, or two of the things that I'd come away from school with. One, wanting to pursue creativity of some kind, but on the other hand, that I needed to have a professional career. So I sort of viewed the camera as a balance between these two elements, and one with which I could both be creative and also potentially have make a profession, make a career out of.
Yeah, because photography in particular is, as you say, it's a creative profession, but it's one that strikes me particularly important when we start looking at conflict and taking images of conflict, because the old adage, a picture tells 1,000 words. I think it has a special relationship with photojournalists and observing, almost as though kind of the fly on the wall idea. You're capturing a moment in time, and oftentimes it's void of other context, right? You're seeing a picture, and it's again up to the individual to interpret what's happening there, but generally you're capturing a very, very human moment. And if I just think back to you've got a website that I'll put a link to in the show notes as well. But a lot of the photos you've taken, or at least on the website that you put up, are photos of very, very human moments. In this case, mostly from Afghanistan, if I'm right, which we'll get to anyway. But how do you pick moments in general? Like, what is it? What drives you to decide? Okay, there's a frame that I want to take. How do you see what you want to take a photo of?
I think at this point, after carrying a camera around for 15 years or more, it really becomes instinctive, like any craft, I suppose. So I have to sort of dig deep to try and discern what makes my instinct tick. But I think, first and foremost for photographers, it's about light. So I will, unless there's something very specific that I want or need to photograph, I won't go out in the middle of the day. I'll ideally, work between, like an hour before sunrise to 2 hours after sunrise, and then, a couple of hours before sunset to an hour after sunset. Between those hours, I find it incredibly difficult to get inspired about what I'm pointing the camera at.
Right.
There are often, obviously, scenarios where I don't have the luxury to choose when to photograph. But I suppose that comes to a second element, which determines what I'm drawn to, and that's the subject matter, obviously. So I think photography often comes down to depicting like a human connection of some kind. So that often means you're photographing two or more people having some kind of interaction, whether it's one of adversity or enmity or one of love and affection. It's these kind of emotions that a camera is very, very good at depicting in a way that other mediums are not. So, these are the kinds of things I look for. And then beyond that, I think, as you mentioned, you can take a photograph of a moment in time, which is devoid of the context outside the boundaries of the frame that you've chosen to focus on. And that is also really important to me. And that's something I've learnt since being in Afghanistan. And I was having this conversation the other day, and hopefully I can articulate better now than I did then. But I think, for example, now the circumstances under which one can take a photograph, depending on, for example, in a place like Afghanistan, who controls a certain area at a certain time, although it may change absolutely nothing figuratively in a photograph, it changes everything in the external context. So if I'm photographing a little boy and a little girl running down the street in a rural district in a province outside Kabul, if that little boy and that little girl are running down a street in a village controlled by the government, it means one thing. And if they're doing the same thing in that village at another time when it's controlled by the Taliban, that means something else altogether. So these are the kinds of things that a photograph alone cannot depict, and which needs to be bolstered by, a caption or some kind of context, in whatever medium one chooses.
No, absolutely, and I think that's the important part of the narrative that surrounds the photo. But I think there's an interesting point you made about the raw emotion and the kind of almost extreme emotions of love, joy, happiness, or fear, anger, or whatever it might be. Those emotions are the same regardless of who you're taking a photo of or where. And I think that to me anyway. Whether you're taking photos of quote unquote the enemy, or of the Taliban, or of soldiers, or of children, the emotion on people's faces, we all display the same emotions, we all feel the same emotions, and I think the photo captures that so powerfully, and can also then tell that human story perhaps better than other mediums, or at least that's why I find it, which is why I'm absolutely fascinated by photojournalists in general, because the title says it. You are a journalist. You're trying to, you're part of the fourth estate to, speak truth to power and bring to light things that are otherwise left unseen. Which will kind of take us to where I hope most of the conversation will reside, and that's in Afghanistan. But before we get there, you went to New York, right? And then you moved to Kabul. What did you do in New York? What sort of work were you doing there?
Good question. I had this really bizarre idea, now that I look back at it, that having worked in Australia, worked in Sydney for primarily Australian publications, and then having gone freelance and expanding my horizons a little bit to outside Australia and starting to work for these big American publications, I thought, well, if these are the publications I want to work for, then I have to go to where they're based and be close to them geographically. Of course, that is a completely ridiculous idea, because although their offices might be in New York or Washington DC, the stories that they're reporting are happening all over the world. Even in Australia. So I had this this strange notion that's what I needed to do, and in a way it helped me to an extent, in that I was able to meet some of the editors and so on that I would go on to work with in the future, which is important, unfortunately, in this industry. You need to go and kiss the ring, so to speak.
I think that's important in every industry, right?
I guess you're right. Yeah, but particularly so, I think, for as a freelancer, where you're.
Of course, yeah. You don't work for anyone,
yeah, if you don't know the editors, then they're not going to call you when they need someone in Afghanistan or wherever it is. So,
Of course.
The work I was doing, to answer your question, was, I mean, I was doing pretty mundane work. You know, any job that had come along, like, you know, photographing a businessman for the New York Times' business pages. I remember the first time that happened, and I was, you know, overjoyed. To a couple of, you know, I had a couple of interesting assignments. The most interesting was probably photographing Hurricane Sandy for Time magazine, which you might remember. I think it was 2012, and you know, big hurricane came up the east coast and turned New York City dark. But then, yeah, it didn't take long. I didn't have to spend too much time in Afghanistan to realise that this was the place that, or a place that I found far more fulfilling and invigorating as a photographer.
Because then I guess that's what you got an assignment. Is that? I mean, can you just explain how these assignments? I mean, someone tells you, "I want a photo of X, Y, Z," and you go and find it. And is that what happened with the Afghan cricket team?
That's how it happens ideally, but in reality, more often than not, you will come up with an idea, and particularly if you don't have a lot of experience, or if you don't have good connections, you will go and, you know, report and or photograph that topic, write the story, produce the photographs, and then pitch the idea once it's all done and dusted, rather than an editor having to take a risk and pay your expenses and take on the liability of you traveling to a place like Afghanistan. It's much easier for them to sign on to a story that's already been produced. So that's what we did. My friend at the time, Claire, and I traveled to Kabul, and we, you know, off our own bat, and we spent a couple of weeks working on this story, traveling around with the cricket team before they, or as they were training for their first appearance in a World Cup, which was going to happen in Australia the next year in 2014. And we ended up selling the story to the Good Weekend magazine in Australia.
Right. Okay. Well, there you go. And I guess that's where it all started, or your Afghan odyssey started, I guess. Did you, after those 2 weeks, you finished that assignment, you then decided to stay from there on in?
Pretty much. It happened slowly. I mean, like Claire and I kept extending our visas for months at a time until the 3 months limit expired and we had to leave. And by the end of that 3 months, I was pretty set on staying. So I went back to New York, packed up my things, then back to Sydney, and collected a few belongings and headed back and set up shop in Kabul.
And why Afghanistan? What captured you about Afghanistan?
I think for the first time, I was working in a place where I felt photography meant something to me, or meant more to me than it had before. Whereas previously, it had been about making aesthetically beautiful photographs that didn't necessarily mean a lot. In Afghanistan, those two notions came together, and I found meaning in this medium that I'd developed a passion for over the previous 10 years or so. And then on top of that, I also quite enjoyed I made some friends here, and despite some of the limitations on social life here, I quite liked the lifestyle. I found the work exciting and seriously challenging, and I felt that it was an important story, that although the wind had gone out of the sails, both of the international military effort and the international community's interest more generally in the country, I felt like I was in the middle of this really important global story that would be looked at and read about for decades and centuries to come. and the fact that I was living in the middle of it and could step out my front gate and be photographing this world was, it was really exciting. And yeah, just I felt invigorated by the medium of photography in a way that I hadn't been previously.
Mm. And that was in 2013 or 14 that you, I guess, moved there?
I came for the first time end of 2013 and moved early 14.
Right. I mean, and I guess the war, so to speak, was well and truly still going on. It was in its 13th year by that stage. What was your view from the ground like? What did you go and take photos of? Because I'm conscious of what your subsequent work, in particularly what your written word, what you cover. But how, what did you start taking photos of initially?
Before I'd come here, all I really knew of Afghanistan, or the majority of what I knew of Afghanistan, was these, in terms of imagery anyway, were these scenes of foreign soldiers in, wearing camouflage, military fatigues, walking through dusty alleyways or through wheat fields in rural areas, looking out of place amid, the Afghans that they were working and fighting amongst. But I knew very little of those Afghans themselves. And I think that was mostly because of the difficulty of working in a place like Afghanistan for outsiders meant that most foreign reporters and photographers were embedding, as we say, with the foreign military forces, whether it be the Americans or the Australians or Brits or whoever it was. That was the window into Afghanistan that most of us consumers of news and media were viewing the country through. And so we weren't really seeing Afghanistan at all. We were seeing the foreign intervention in it. And, I'm conscious that it's easy for me to say that now because that kind of window it doesn't really exist. And it didn't really exist after I arrived here in 13, 14. And I'm sure that if I had been working in the first decade of the century, I too probably would have been doing those kinds of embeds and depicting the country through that lens. So, but regardless, that's how I had. That was the picture I had of the country. And so when I came here and discovered that the foreign presence was, really on the wane, and that the foreign soldiers who were still here weren't really interested in sharing their experiences because the war had sort of gone south, and the foreign governments and militaries were not so interested in opening up to journalists and opening up the doors to journalists to show them what they were doing anymore, as they had been when they were trying to gain support for the war in the earlier years. That not being an option for me, it happened quite naturally that I turned towards the Afghans themselves, those people who were living through the war, and the Afghan soldiers and defense forces themselves.
That's and I think that's really where my interest lies as well. I mean, the title of the podcast is The Voices of War, and I think you and I spoke about this briefly previously. It's one of the things we don't necessarily discuss is the view of the people on the ground who are paying the price. And I think you hit the nail on the head by saying that we had embeds initially, and the news reports that we see back at home or in our homes, I'm speaking broadly as the coalition, the different countries, is from the kind of tightly controlled, oftentimes, media that were part of the embedded with the forces. Now, what was the story that you saw with the Afghan people? Or how different was the story that you saw through your lens that they lived to the story that we lived back home?
I think to begin with, when I first arrived, I was viewing everything in Afghanistan as a threat, everything and every person as a potential threat. And I think that's probably something that most international soldiers and military forces can appreciate. I think as I've since come to notice, the difference here between me as a civilian, journalist or photographer in civilian clothes, to me embedded with, as I have been on just a couple of occasions with international forces, heavily armed and in uniform. There's a huge discrepancy between how I perceive I'm viewed as one and the other. Not that I have personally been in uniform myself, but even when I'm around people in uniform, I feel that the eyes on me and those around me have a very different tone to those.
Well, you're part of that frame, right? You're part of that particular militarized frame that people are seeing.
Exactly, and it's not only now. I think I was talking to some people from Wardak province, which is adjoins Kabul, and it's seen a huge amount of fighting in the last 20 years. Just last week, and they were telling me about the first time they encountered Americans in probably early 2002, and they were saying they felt they were curious about them, but they were also very wary and very suspicious. And so it's interesting that I think that's still, that's probably held true ever since the Soviets came in 79 through to today. That said, I'm astounded by the fact that, given what almost every Afghan has experienced in the last 40 years, which has been at the hands of foreign military forces, which I think it's probably fair to say most people have a less than positive view or memory of those forces. Of course, there are a lot of exceptions and at both ends of the spectrum. But I think my point was that despite the view that the majority of Afghans would hold foreign military forces and by extension foreigners in general, the way I'm received by 99 out of 100 Afghans always astounds me. It's very rare that I'll meet anyone in the street for in passing or for a conversation where I'm not invited back to the house for tea or involved in a conversation about Australia or wherever it is they're from. It's an incredibly warm, strangely welcoming environment and culture, in spite of everything that outsiders have brought them, good and bad.
Yeah, that's interesting. Do you speak any of the language? Do you speak Pushto at all, or?
Look, I was hoping you wouldn't ask that. No,
I can cut that out.
I hate to say that I'm extremely ashamed of the lack of language that I've picked up. I think my excuse is that for the first few years that I was here, I always thought I was leaving within 6 months or so. So I never committed to learning the language, and then and then when I finally did, after 3 or 4 years being here, something always happened once I did start. Once I started lessons seriously, I think the first time I was about 10 lessons in, and my house burnt down.
Jeez. Okay.
Just from a domestic accident, and then the second time, my Dari teacher, Dari is sort of the official language here, one of the two major ones, Dari and Pashto. But my Dari teacher was attacked by my dog.
Okay.
And then the third time, after my Dari teacher had recovered, my house, we were told, ended up on a list of ISIS targets. So we had to leave the house the next day, and once again I sort of lost momentum, and I never really regained.
Well, I'm not surprised, mate, given the the nature of events that come with you wanting to learn the language. I'm not surprised by you've stopped trying. I don't. But it's still very interesting. I still find it. So I guess you interact with the locals mainly through an interpreter. Is that accurate? Or?
It depends. I mean, on a day-to-day basis, I can certainly get by in Kabul.
Mm-hmm.
But when I'm working and when I really need to know what people are telling me, yes, I'll always be working with an interpreter. And working with an interpreter is not just to enable me to have conversations with people and to explain what I'm doing and ask about their stories, but also to navigate local environments. And I'll always work with someone where possible from the specific area that I'm working in, whether from province to province or even for different areas in Kabul.
Yeah, that's I like the term local environments, because I think, if I'm correct in assessing what you mean there, is that it varies greatly, and I think this is one of the great downfalls that are going to be studied for decades to come, like you kind of alluded to before, about our great misunderstanding of Afghanistan, and that we kind of had these overarching narratives of, anybody that's against us is Taliban and everyone that's for us is, part of the government, and so on. How do you view that kind of black and white narrative now that you've been there for so long? How accurately does it represent what you see on the ground?
Something I've realized, and people will wonder why I'm only realizing this now, but something I've realized increasingly in recent years is the extent to which the foreign military forces and to an extent their partners in Afghanistan, but primarily the foreign military forces early on in the war, created an enemy that, it's not that it didn't exist, but it had certainly gone to ground and was only lurking latently at the time in the sort of mid 2000s. And I think I'm not sure how much you want to get into it, but to look at the example of the Australian Special Forces in Uruzgan, I think there's an argument to be made that a lot of those who ended up fighting not only the Australians but the government that they were supporting, and then who have gone on to continue fighting the government now that they're the only soldiers the only opponents they have to fight, are doing so because they were drawn to do so because of the treatment they received at the hands of, for example, some of the Australian Special Forces soldiers in Uruzgan. And I think, I just hear that over and over again. Speaking of that, that's the people I was referring to in Wardak province recently. And I'm actually working on a story about this now, about a family who didn't have any specific allegiance to the government or the Taliban, but who had, who in the very final years of the war in 2019 had a horrific experience with some American forces supported by Afghan partners, and that that turned them against that gave them reason to support the Taliban, whereas previously they were relatively agnostic about who to support. They just they were happy to live their lives out in the villages, but that all changed once they were given reason to, or given a motive to pick a side. So I think, look, the same can be said for people who have been victims of Taliban violence as well, for sure. But I think picking or defining the Taliban at large or en masse as the enemy is, it's a very simplistic way of looking at things, and I think a lot of those that do so are ignoring the fact that we as international interlopers created a lot of them.
Mm. How much did we or do we understand the local context, the local dynamics that occurred there? And I ask this as somebody who's been there, who, while I sleep easy at night, certainly played my part in a small way in contributing to some of these narratives and interpretations of those. How well do you think we actually understand Afghanistan?
Not in the slightest. I mean, I've been here nearly 8 years, and I mean, the longer I stay here, the more I realise how little I understand. And I'm talking about a broad understanding, whereas the reality is, every village here has different dynamics which need to be understood before getting involved in them. I can't remember. I think it was David Petraeus who commanded international forces here after McChrystal, I think in 2011 and 12, who said in the last couple of years that if we'd had the time again following 9/11, the best thing to have done would have been to spend a year studying Afghanistan before setting the first boot on the ground. And I imagine had that been done, things would have played out. Could potentially have played out very differently. I think the foreign forces would have chosen their allies very differently. That was another reason for what fueled what we know as the Taliban. That being the fact that the international forces who kicked off the war in late 2001, quite logically at the time, sided with the foes of the group that they were trying to oust from power, most of whom happened to be, members of the, either the Tajik or the Hazara or the Uzbek Northern Alliance, people from those ethnic minorities anyway. And so from that moment on, I think, the enmity between the Taliban of the 90s and that the northern ethnic minorities was compounded. So not only were those Northern Alliance leaders or warlords or whatever you want to call them empowered militarily, they were also given the high-ranking positions in the government or in the Ministry of Defence or Ministry of the Interior, and it's widely thought amongst the communities that suffered the most under them, and these are primarily communities living in majority Pashtun areas in the east and the south, at least in the early years of the war. But didn't see any of the benefits that were coming to the constituencies of these former Northern Alliance leaders, and so that stoked that enmity. And then on top of that, you had the foreign forces, primarily Americans and Brits in the early years, allied with the Northern Alliance leaders, their militias and their commanders, and carrying out in a lot of cases like retribution for what had happened in the years before the Americans and the Brits came to Afghanistan. And so it just compounded these old tribal, ethnic, inter-community beef that already existed, and served to further sort of divide the population.
I was just going to say on that point, I think the fact that we became an actor in that kind of ecosystem, it's a term that I've kind of used throughout other episodes as well, because I think that it's alive. It's something that's not fixed. It's not black and white. It's full of color. It's anything but simple. We came in as, I guess, another actor, and we empowered some of those local actors whilst we suppressed others, and we contributed to those dynamics. And I guess that's the point I'm thinking you're making as well. And the outcomes of the inquiries and investigations into alleged war crimes and so on, they will tell their story. But I guess the power of narrative, again, is what's important here. While I certainly don't intend to comment on the investigations, but the narratives of alleged war crimes is perhaps sufficient, whether they're true or not. It's almost irrelevant. Mm-hmm. They carry power in themselves, right? So how are people in Afghanistan perceiving Australians or more broadly coalition forces in general after these allegations have come out?
You might be surprised to hear that when the allegations from the Brereton report were published, there wasn't a huge reaction here in Afghanistan. I think, beyond those who were immediately affected, so much has happened before and since those alleged crimes took place that, people have moved on. People have experienced traumatic events since then. There's, dozens and dozens of fighters on both sides dying each day in, day out at the moment. And it's just, I don't think people, have either the ability or the willingness to, go back and dredge up these old memories. I think it's obviously more acute for those who experience them themselves. But I think, like, more generally, it's just more grist for the mill for those who argue that the foreign military intervention here was, at least to a degree, responsible for inflaming or fueling the insurgency, which didn't exist. I mean, it wasn't an insurgency for the first couple of years. People, even the Talibs, they went to ground, or some of them, yes, for sure, went back to Pakistan to regroup and probably started, plotting things fairly soon after they fled. But for most people, I think it took a spark for them to pick up a weapon again, or for the first time. And I just think there were so many sparks nationwide that the insurgency was inevitable. Come sort of 2006, 2007.
Mm. And I guess the quote unquote collateral damage that people have experienced, or they became collateral damage, I guess, in this war. And I think you won the Gold Walkley Award for a particular photo that is very much a result of quote unquote collateral damage, or an accident. Not even planned a collateral damage, that it was part of an estimate and approved and so on, which in itself is crazy, and it's going to be a discussion I'll have later with some ethicists on this very point. But maybe you can tell us a little bit about that. Firstly, about that photo, and again, I'll share a link to it, the notes. But what was the photo, and tell us how you got to actually take that picture.
So I think the photo you're referring to is of the man who's lying dead on a operating table in a hospital.
Yes.
The hospital is in Kunduz, which is a city in the north of Afghanistan. It was under the auspice of American and German troops for the most part throughout the war. And there was a hospital there that was run by Médecins Sans Frontières. It had been running for 5 or 6 years at the time. And it was the biggest hospital in northern Afghanistan for patients of war trauma. In September 2015, the Taliban overran Kunduz city, which is a provincial capital of the same province. And it was the first time the Taliban had overrun a provincial capital since they were ousted from power in 2001. So it was a big, it was a huge event in the context of the war. It was a big, news event for journalists, and it became even bigger when, about a week into the battle to retake Kunduz city, which was being fought by some American special forces along with Afghan commandos and special forces. And about a week into that, while an American Green Beret team were trying to fight their way out from a police, the police headquarters in the middle of the city, an airstrike was called on a building a few hundred meters away, but for various reasons, and I don't think the whole story is entirely clear yet. The AC-130, which you'll know, Maz, is basically a cargo aircraft refitted or rekitted out to be a really fearsome close air support aircraft with a number of different weapons, including cannons and a Gatling gun. So it's one of the most feared aircraft, certainly by the Taliban in Afghanistan, primarily because they associate it with there being soldiers, foreign soldiers, on the ground in close proximity to that aircraft. But in any case, this AC-130, instead of striking this supposed target, hit the Médecins Sans Frontières hospital, which was full of patients at the time. The hospital was at capacity because of all the fighting that had been going on in and around the city. And when it was struck by several hundred rounds of various shapes and sizes, by the end of I think it was an hour or more, maybe it was half an hour, barrage of fire, 43 patients, hospital staff and patient carers were killed. And I think there were probably a dozen staff who were killed. The majority of the rest of the victims were patients in the hospital. And one of the victims was this man who I found out about later on, who had been shot in the leg during the week as he was going to check on his place of work in the city, and he got caught in the middle of some crossfire, ended up in the hospital. He'd had one operation to remove the round in his thigh, and he was going in for his second operation to stitch up the wound, and he would have made a full recovery and probably been released in a couple of days. But it was soon after he'd gone under general anaesthetic that the AC-130 started firing on the compound, and I later connected with some of the surgeons who were operating on him at the time, as well as the family of the man who was fatally wounded by shrapnel from some of the rounds from the AC-130, and who obviously never woke up from his anaesthesia. And this photo, depicted him basically lying on the operating table where he'd been put under anaesthetic, and where the doctors and surgeons had to eventually abandon him on the operating table because he was a fully grown, fully anaesthetized male who, under the circumstances, they just couldn't carry out of the room, nor were they sure that they'd be able to get him to safety if they could. They were just as likely to be killed as he was. But basically, to capture that photo, I was in Kabul when it happened, and news started filtering out that night about what had happened, and it became clearer the next morning. And I'd already started making attempts to get to Kunduz with the Afghan military, and waking up to that news, or hearing that news the night that it happened. Sorry, it was the following morning, actually. My efforts became a lot more urgent, and I was able to fly to Mazar-i-Sharif, which is another city in the north, with a letter from the Ministry of Defence that I was to hand the Corps headquarters up there, the ANA, Afghan National Army Corps headquarters in Mazar, from where, in theory, I was going to be able to hitch a ride on an ANA helicopter to Kunduz. It took about 2 days waiting on a helicopter landing zone at the Corps headquarters in Mazar before a helicopter which supposedly had a little bit of room for me, another journalist, and the local photographer who we were working with, who was going to be interpreting for us. And we jumped on we didn't ask any questions. We were just so desperate to get there at the stage. We jumped on the back loading ramp and we could barely squeeze in. The helicopter was it was one of these old Russian helicopters, Russian transport helicopters, and we could barely get on. It was full of boxes of apples as well as coffins with dead bodies in them, dead bodies of Afghan soldiers that were being transported to their home provinces. So we ended up, the tail ramp went up, and the pilot tried to take off, and a minute later we got yelled at from one of the door gunners that we were too heavy, and he started underarming apples to us so we could eat the apples and in theory shed some of the weight in the helicopter. Which I thought was pretty funny, but
wow.
Anyway, we ended up taking off, and I was sitting on one of these coffins. Like there was nowhere else to sit. We landed in Kunduz half an hour later, and we had our official embed papers stamped by the Ministry of Defence, but from this brigade headquarters in Kunduz, where the mission to retake Kunduz city was being staged from, no one wanted to take us into Kunduz city. No one wanted the responsibility of a couple of foreign journalists on their hands. So we spent 6 days just tearing our hair out, trying to get out of the base. And it wasn't until the seventh day, or 7 days after the hospital had been attacked, that we basically hitched a ride with an Afghan army major who spoke some Russian, as did my journalist colleague, and they sort of hit it off. And we asked him where he was going. He said they were going on a mission to try and outflank a small group of Taliban on the edge of town. And we asked him, can we jump in? And we happened to have all our kit with us at the time, so he literally just jumped in the back of his truck and didn't bother asking our public affairs officer who had responsibility for us. And so we ended up spending the day with this major and his and a couple of platoons of ANA as they were sort of rounding up a few last Talibs on the edge of town. And then towards the end of the day, I started speaking to people at MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, in Kabul, about getting to the hospital because it was the closest I'd been to it at that point. And between them and I, we were able to arrange a driver to come and pick me up. And so I basically absconded from the major. Actually, I didn't. He said I was free to go, and jumped in with this driver who drove me to the hospital through the city, which was still, he knew the city, so he knew where to drive, but there was still fighting going on in the city. And dropped me off at the door at the hospital. And I spent the next about 2 hours in the hospital, just basically documenting, as forensically as I could, as comprehensively as I could, and as uncreatively as I could, what I saw, because no one had been in the hospital yet. No one knew what had happened. And even a week later, there was probably still at least a dozen dead bodies in there that had not been removed. And it wasn't until I'd been there for probably 2 hours and was starting to get worried about the time. It was starting to get dark outside, and I really didn't want to be caught in the city after dark. And that I got into the least damaged part of the hospital, which was a couple of operating theatres. And I sort of stuck my head in one, took a couple of quick photos, and then stuck my head in another. And it was pretty dark in there. And when my eyes adjusted, I saw this man lying on the table, and I spent a couple of minutes in there sort of photographing from every angle, and then I got out and I ended up getting on a flight back to Kabul the following day that the ANA were all too happy to put us on. And I actually went back to MSF that night, where there are a bunch of MSF staff who'd flown in from Belgium, where their headquarters is, in the aftermath of this attack, and to show them the photos basically that I'd taken. So it was a pretty heavy night, showing sort of unrecognizable bodies, some of whom were probably MSF staff members, and as well as patients and so on. And then following that, I ended up tracking down, with the help of MSF, the family or working out, first of all, who the man on the table was, and then tracking down his family and finding out about what had led up to the point where he'd ultimately been killed on the table. And I'm still in touch with the family, actually, every now and then to this day.
Yeah, it's an absolutely powerful image, and I think the story behind it as well. And again, I'll put the link in for the story as well. I find it interesting that you then try and go and find the story out. What motivates you to do that, rather than just taking a photo and, hey, here's the results? What makes you? What drives you to reach out and find out the story behind the person in your frame?
I think, look, we so often are confronted with photos of dead bodies in foreign countries, whether we're a reader or a viewer in Australia or the US or Europe or wherever it is, and we have no connection to the lives of the people in those photos. And I'm guilty of contributing to that dynamic as well. But in this case, I guess there was more reason to dig deeper and find out what had happened to this guy, what had led up to him being in the hospital, being operated on there. Because at the time there were a lot of accusations and counter-accusations flying around about whether those in the hospital were Taliban fighters or whether they were, innocent civilians or staff members. So that was partly the reason for my looking into it, to try and verify who this guy was, because he was, I'm sorry to say, one of the few, or if not the only body that remained when I was there that was still somewhat recognizable. All the others had been, basically incinerated, whereas Bainazar was his name. His body was still largely intact, and so it was possible to identify him both by the injuries that he was being treated for on the operating table and by his appearance, and also by where he was located in the hospital at the time of his death.
Mm. And I think the important part here is that as you then uncover the story and you find out that he's a father. I think he's got or had 3 children. He's a husband, and I think we can draw. We can. It's very easy to say it's war. Accidents happen. C'est la vie. That's what happened. But we and I speak from my personal experience. I mean, I was a child of the Bosnian War, and my members of my family died in dubious circumstances and so on. We tend to forget the emotion that ignites within people. They don't care if it's an accident or not. They care that their husband, their father, has now been killed by, these foreign forces. Whether they're fighting a good fight or not, that becomes irrelevant. It's very easy to understand why people very quickly can turn against what some might argue are good motives. Others will say the motives themselves were corrupt. Again, that's not the point, and certainly not a point I'm trying to make. But bottom line is that once people die, once people lose family members, it's very easy for them to turn against those who've perpetrated those quote-unquote accidents. Mm-hmm. Is this what...
it really is.
Yeah. Is this then what... Or maybe the question I want to ask is, how do you then transition from being a photojournalist who takes these rather powerful images that, were seen around the world and have been recognized for the power they hold? How did you turn then into now an author and also an author who's, again, with some genuine credibility and some accolades? And I've read your work as well, and it's really, really powerful stuff, and broadly recognized for being quite intuitive journalism. How did you then kind of go from a photojournalist to now arguably also a writer?
Well, coincidentally, that transition partly happened around that photograph, purely out of necessity, because having been alone when I took that photograph without a writer colleague, as I often would be, I suppose I saw the necessity of writing around that photograph and, adding context, as we were talking about before, to that photograph. And I guess, that responsibility fell to me just because I was there and I had some investment in the story. And for the first time, or for one of the first times, I didn't feel like sort of handing that off to someone else, someone who might have been more recognized as a photographer. And I owe, to a large extent, my credit for being given the opportunity to write that to the editor I worked with at the time, with whom I'd worked on a couple of things previously, but this was certainly by far the most important story that we'd worked on together. And she was very patient with me. She knew I didn't have a lot of writing experience, but she didn't. I would send her a draft, and she would make me rewrite the bits she didn't like. She wouldn't rewrite them for me. She'd make me do it, and it was painful at the time. But I learned some really valuable lessons through that story and through other stories we've worked on subsequently. And from then on, I started to see the value in writing, what were in many ways just extended captions for my stories, or fleshing out the context around the photos that I was taking. I'd already, to go back another step, I guess I would say that my writing started kind of informally through Instagram, where I would have to provide context to the photos I was taking. And, I started seeing that as a way to practice my writing. And it went from there to the point where today, as you mentioned, I'm actually focusing more on writing than I am on photography. So the writing is coming first now, and the photographs are supplementing the writing, whereas previously it was happening in reverse. And I suppose I see that as the result of wanting to illustrate stories in a way that photos have their limits, whereas I've found that I've been able to describe stories and situations and historical events in more detail through text, where photos are able to illustrate an aspect of that story, or to even decorate in a purely design sense for in the way a story is laid out on the internet or in a magazine. And I like that combination, actually, and I like the format of a long, detailed, investigative style piece of journalism interwoven with photos that are relevant to it.
And I guess it makes you rather unique in that sense, because you're now the full package. You do the writing and the image as well. And I think, judging by the two celebrated pieces, the one that your first one that came out about a CIA-led Afghan militia that was responsible for several massacres in 2019, and then the one that came out in April with the monthly, the Voice Form of Defence, new revelations of Australian war crimes in Afghanistan. I guess the story you're also telling is the story that we, the West, don't want to see. We don't want to confront in many ways. Would that be accurate?
I think so, yeah. I suppose my focus as a quote unquote journalist are the kinds of stories that people don't want us to hear, or that the powers that be don't want us to hear, or the perpetrators don't want us to hear. And I'm certainly not the first journalist to want to focus on those kinds of stories, but they seem it's instinctive for me at this point to look at those. And yeah, I think it just follows on from, I guess it's another way of looking at the war from the perspectives of the victims, which is, I guess, what my focus has been since I came here, since those prosecuting the war, at least on the Afghan government international side, have become less available for viewing the war. So it seems that it always occurred to me that viewing it and telling stories from the perspective of the victims has been an obvious way to sort of fill that gap. And it's such a huge gap now because there are so few journalists here, since the foreign forces have gone, and since news outlets are so reluctant to take the responsibility for journalists working in conflict zones. Strangely enough, I think it's for often for a very particular reason, that being that there is no longer the guarantee of helicopter evacuation. If anything was if you're injured or worse in a conflict situation, whereas in the past, that when you signed up for an embed with the American forces, you were guaranteed to be treated as a soldier if you were injured, or you were basically with the unit you were with, and they were going to treat you as one of their own while you're with them. So since that element is no longer available, it's much harder for big publications to take on that responsibility.
Yeah, of course. And I guess more broadly speaking, I think your job is one that's quite dangerous. I mean, just explaining that circumstances to get that shot in the hospital is quite incredible, and something that I don't think we give enough credit to, because it's obviously a very dangerous place, not least because there's a war, but you as a journalist also have certain value, I guess, for various motivations that people can exploit. And just by the example that you just said now, you're there doing the job now without any guarantee of getting any first-rate healthcare that we would expect, that you would certainly get in Australia. How do you deal with that? I mean, because that's a pretty big burden to carry as well. I mean, it is, and many of your, I'd imagine you've lost colleagues yourself. I've certainly spoken to, in a previous episode, to a guy from Sarajevo who started a project called the Sniper Alley, where he reached out to photojournalists who went to Sarajevo and took photographs during the war, mainly to find images of his own family and the funeral of his brother who was killed by a sniper. And that's what motivated him. But he then, through that, opened up an entire avenue of reaching out and understanding the hugely dangerous life of being a war correspondent or photojournalist in a conflict zone, or whatever term we use. How do you view that risk?
Good question. I probably view it a little bit differently now to when I did, or to how I did 5 years ago, 6 years ago in Kunduz, for example. And I think that's partly to do with the way I feel about my lack of optimism for the future here in Afghanistan. I think 5 or 6 years ago, I still felt a degree of hope for a better future here, and that there was a reason that people were fighting for and that they believed in. Whereas now it seems to be, at least on the government side, they're really just fighting for survival at this point. And I mean, from my perspective, the writing is on the wall that some form of Taliban takeover, whether it's militarily or politically, or some kind of political settlement. I find it hard to envisage Afghanistan in 5 years' time without the Taliban having a serious degree of control in the country. And I think the fighting at the moment with that kind of inevitability just seems so futile to me that I've definitely recalibrated my my tolerance for risk. So to mitigate it, I guess in the absence of options, in the event that something did happen to me, I try to mitigate them happening in the first place by trusting those with whom I'm working, knowing where I'm going, knowing what the dynamics are in the place I'm traveling to, down to the little things like knowing how best to blend in the specific place where I'm going, like knowing literally like what hat to wear in one place as opposed to another, what style of local clothes, what type of shoes, really little things that could, potentially make a difference between, being recognized as a foreigner somewhere where I wouldn't want to be. And also with, the people I'm in contact with. And I guess a lot of it comes down to trust. And in the 8 years I've been here, I've been fortunate enough to work with people who I have been able to trust and whose trust has gotten me a long way.
Mm. And how do you deal with and I don't know if this is too personal a question, but one of the things that strikes me is that you're taking images of some of the worst things that we do to each other as the human species. And these are the images that generally will make the headlines because they scare us into realizing how horrible we are to each other. But I'd imagine it would have to have an impact on you as well, seeing death and carnage and destruction. What's that impact been on you? How do you deal with it?
So far, it hasn't had an impact that's been any more than short term. Like, I've seen a couple of things that have kept me awake for a couple of days, but which have left my, consciousness to an extent that I've been able to carry on as normal and not have them impact me on a day-to-day basis and not in a disruptive way. Obviously there's things that I carry with me and will always carry with me and will have an impact on my view of the world, but they haven't at this point had an overly disruptive impact. And of course, I'm sure a lot of your listeners and a lot of people who've had experience in conflict zones will warn that doesn't mean they won't these events won't rear their heads in my consciousness in years to come. But I suppose we live in an age where we're a lot more aware of traumatic, the impact of traumatic events and mental health and so on. And I'm pretty aware of all that stuff, and I do keep a close eye on my own mental health. But again, there's only so much you can do if the day comes where all that stuff does make an appearance and wants to screw with your head. There's I guess it's something you have to manage rather than cure. And I've had my own experiences with mental health difficulties in the past, completely unrelated to Afghanistan, and through that I've learned some mechanisms to deal with them and to manage it and to, I guess, prevent it or to recognize it when it's making an appearance or threatening to make an appearance. And for that reason, I'm very deliberate about doing very simple things like trying to exercise every day and eat healthily and not drink too much and all these kinds of things that I guess decrease the likelihood that these things will have adverse impacts.
Mm. Andrew, I'm conscious of the time, and I know we've gone past the kind of agreed hour, but
that's right.
Maybe just a couple of questions to close off on. This is one that we touched on before we started recording, and it kind of leads on from what you're saying now about your life there now, the risk, and also the kind of how you manage risk. But I guess one of the things that's making your life harder now is the fact that Australia has not only decided to withdraw its troops from Afghanistan, along with the US after Biden's decision. We've also now closed our embassy in Kabul. Firstly, how do people feel about that more broadly, both foreigners as well as locals? And then how does that impact on you and other Australians that are still left in Kabul?
How it impacts on Afghans, I mean, without wanting to speak for all Afghans, I think it's been viewed pretty critically. I think it sends a pretty bad message with regard to our country's diplomatic support to Afghanistan, which we're supposedly right behind. It just doesn't symbolically. It's a pretty dismal display, and I think a lot of Afghans are worried that it will kick off a mass exodus of other embassies. That hasn't come to pass yet. I'm happy to say that it certainly makes us stand out in the crowd. And then obviously that there's the issue of the staff from the embassy who appear to have been left high and dry. I know there's a lot of advocates pushing really hard to help them get resettled in Australia. And, as is the case for the US and Brits and every other coalition country who are being pressured to assist those who assisted both military and diplomatic missions here. For Australian citizens like me, I mean, look, the Australian embassy here, I've always had a sort of passing relationship with them, and to different extents through the years. I wouldn't say that I ever sort of relied on them or felt that I could rely on them in the event of some catastrophe in Afghanistan. They were usually pretty reluctant to provide information when they had, or if they had information that was pertinent to Australian citizens. They would usually send out these sort of boilerplate, generic emails that told us that the Australian embassy, didn't advised us not to come to Afghanistan, and if we were here, then we should, leave at the earliest convenience, yada yada. But on the other hand, I mean, personally, I rely on the Australian embassy for some documents that I need to get my visa, which I presume I won't be able to get from them in the future. And moreover, I found it's pretty rude, to be honest, that me and the handful of other Australians here learnt about the embassy closing through the media. I didn't get any notification before or after from the embassy or from DFAT. Maybe I've been scrubbed from their mailing list after my story in the monthly, which was pretty critical of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. But I found that pretty disappointing. I must admit, I had people there that I sort of knew more personally than professionally, and I found it pretty disappointing that we didn't get a bit of a heads up. I think that if the consular section of a foreign embassy is not there to, if the job of if one aspect of a consular section of a foreign embassy isn't to notify citizens when it's closing, what is it? So it was pretty disappointing little period, I'd say.
Yeah. No, and I think you make the point that trying to get at least the people that have supported both the military and the diplomatic mission to try and resettle them in Australia, that's certainly getting a lot more attention in the media back here. So we'll see how that unfolds. Well, maybe the last question that I want to finish on. You made the point that you're not very hopeful about the future of Afghanistan. What's the future of Afghanistan look like in your view? And do you see yourself there much longer, or are you going to explore other options?
The future I find pretty hard to envisage without either escalated violence leading to some kind of Taliban takeover, or a Taliban takeover that is a result of some sort of political settlement, which I find pretty unlikely, an unlikely scenario. So I just I can't see a short to near-term future that doesn't involve an escalation in violence, with the ultimate outcome being the Taliban retaining the power that they once had. I feel like all the momentum is in their favour. The departure of the Americans is going to lift that thumb that they had placed on the Afghan government's side of the scale. And I mean, even with that, in the past 5 years, it's been the Taliban who've been, taking territory slowly but surely, to the point that today they control, I think, more than half of the geographic territory, which doesn't necessarily mean they control half the population, and that's not the case. But I think, they have the momentum, the morale, and the will, which is increasingly devoid in the government ranks. And I feel very sorry for the Afghan security forces at the moment, who are in many cases maintaining these little outposts which are completely surrounded by the Taliban, simply so the central government can claim that they still maintain some control in these rural districts. In reality, all these soldiers in these outposts are doing are trying to survive. They're not providing any services. They are not. They don't have any population under their control. They are literally there to plant a flag on the map to suggest that the government has a bit of control there. And they either, a friend of mine who recently flew into one of these outposts in a government helicopter said the Afghan helicopter pilots who were ferrying in ammunition and food from time to time, all they were doing was delivering food and taking out bodies. So it's a pretty dire state of affairs, and you've got the Taliban encircling more and more provincial capitals, certainly more and more district capitals. And I think since the 1st of May, which was the date by which the Americans had initially agreed to withdraw by, there's been about 10 district centres that have fallen to the Taliban. So it just seems like that momentum, as I said before, is just all in the Taliban's favour.
That's not a very optimistic prognosis, but I'm afraid it's one from the ground. So will you stick around, or what are you thinking? I mean, is it going to be safe for you to stick around for much longer?
Look, I don't think Kabul's going to fall overnight or anything. It's tricky though. I mean, it depends. It depends a lot on how long the airport can stay open. I think that's a canary in the coal mine moment for a lot of foreigners. I don't think Kabul would be a place that any foreigners would really want to be if the Taliban did take over. Certainly in the days that happened, I imagine there'd be a lot of appetite for revenge and reprisals, and I don't think they'd be interested in sort of, checking your credentials and who you've worked for, and the kinds of stories or how impartial you've been in your reporting before dealing with you. So, but yeah, look, I think that's probably a way off. And look, either way, although I'd like to start spending more time outside of Afghanistan, I can't imagine I'll ever leave here for good. It's certainly a place that has gotten under my skin and has been hard for me to leave, and it will be a hard moment when that day does come, although it'll be somewhat dampened by the fact that I know that I'll probably always come back.
Good man. Andrew, like I said, I know we've gone way over our agreed time, but your story is just fascinating, and I think
again, there is so much more we could talk about. But I take my hat off to you for what you do. I think what you and your colleagues do, putting your lives on the line to capture moments and write stories about things that would otherwise never seen the light of day, I think it's very honourable. And we don't give it enough credit, I think. We often just embrace the dominant narrative because that's easier. And I think it's people like you who burst that illusion of simplicity through the images and stories that you write. And I congratulate you on that. And I wish you all the best, mate, and stay safe, and hope to chat to you again in the future.
Thanks a lot, Naz. Look forward to it.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of The Voices of War. You can access all episodes on www.thevoicesofwar.com or by subscribing wherever you get your favourite podcasts. And while you're there, please give us a review, as we'd love to hear what you think. If you'd like to recommend a guest for the show, you can reach me on info@thevoicesofwar.com.